My experience as a detransitioner does not invalidate the experiences of trans people. I have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. However, I don't currently identify as anything other than my birth sex. So I'm not trans. And I know people don't like me saying that I was trans. The reason I sometimes say that is because I lived as a trans person, not because I think I'm the same as anyone who experiences gender dysphoria and anyone who identifies out of their birth sex, because I don't. The concern is that some people may be in the same boat as me, where they have gender dysphoria, but the transition may not work for them. But that doesn't invalidate their identities as a trans person. It doesn't mean that people shouldn't transition, and it certainly doesn't mean that we should turn around telling trans people that we're not going to support them because we think it's possible that it's just a phase or it's not going to work. Meet people where they're at. Show them love and support and acceptance, and if they change their minds or something happens and they realise that actually this didn't work out for them, support them again still. No one's trying to harm anyone else by identifying as trans, so I don't see any reason we should deny it to them. Turning around and saying, you know what, I've actually changed my mind, or I've learned something new about myself and this isn't how I feel anymore, that's hard. But I've been there and I really want to help. Now, in terms of the logistics of how to come out as detrans, I think a commenter even said this, where they said basically just come out like you came out as trans. And I think that is a really good point, is to not overcomplicate it. One thing I would say is that you could have a think about the language you might use. So if you're thinking about how to tell people that you want to start identifying with your birth gender again, you want to start using, your birth pronouns, perhaps you've made a decision whether you want to use your birth name or not, and either way is fine. I know detransitioners who still go by their trans name even if they identify with their birth sex and it seems at odds with them. You don't need to make every decision now. But if you want to start talking to people, because it's so hard to be living in a way that doesn't feel congruent with who you are. I did it for several months with different categories in my life, and it is really difficult. I would think about the language you're going to use. So you might want to say, I made a mistake, I was wrong about this. And you can say those things, but you might find that this actually isn't the narrative you want to put across. You might find that saying something like, this journey has been amazing and it's taught me more about myself and I've learnt this. Or you might want to say, going through this has really taught me that actually I can live happily now as my birth sex, and I'm so delighted to know this about myself, or I'm so grateful that you've shown me all this support and it makes me feel comfortable coming out now as who I or as my birth sex. You'll know that the reason I started my detransition was due to a medical issue, and it was really alongside that questioning and coming off of testosterone that I started to really question my gender identity. When I came off testosterone, I lived for a period of about 4 months identified as non-binary. I think there are a lot of reasons for this, and it's something that I have seen come up a lot of times when speaking to other detransitioners, this idea of using a non-binary identity as a safe space to explore your gender when you've been identified as especially a binary transition. Now, to caveat that, non-binary identities are absolutely valid, and they don't always mark someone who's in the process of moving towards another place, but it can be a safe place for us to do this. I had essentially gotten to the point where I thought that I couldn't live with my body as it was and be a woman anymore, and I didn't want to remain in a trans identity as a man, so I felt like I had to identify as non-binary just to get through the rest of my life. This is really harmful to my mental health, and I think a lot of people would understand that living forced in an identity that isn't quite yours is not going to be good for anyone. All of us experience that who've gone through a transition, who've said, I can't live like this just because it would be easier to do so. It took me finding detransitioners and detransitioners that I could speak to and relate to realize that there was a way I could live my life as a woman again, even with having had these surgeries and these hormones. I felt like it wasn't possible in some ways until I'd found people who represented that. Say, everyone's experience is valid. If that's their experience, we shouldn't be denying other people their experience of the world, even if they sometimes seem as if they contradict, it is simply a contradicting experience that doesn't invalidate someone else. When someone transitions, we should say, okay, that's your experience, I support you. And when they detransition, or if they detransition, we should say, okay, you've learnt this about yourself, and really listen to what they have to say. If they say, I made a mistake and what I did was wrong, then that's their experience. Whereas if they say, I'm so glad I went through that transition, but I now feel like I would be happier living again as my birth sex or as another gender entirely, then that also is their experience, and we should appreciate where they're coming from and meet them where they're at. In terms of putting measures in place politically, I just think we need to uplift voices of everyone so that informed consent really is informed, that we've heard everyone's voice, and when you go through or go towards a transition, you know about detransitioners, and you know why people detransition, and when they've shared that information, that can really help inform decisions.